Welcome. So this is the presentation I'm gonna start for an aspect of the muscular system. I've got to apologise if you can hear my dog sort of whimpering at the door. She may be a continued nuisance. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just go through the first sort of 10 or so slides, so that you have a good grasp of muscle type. So something we touched on in class, but I just want to sort of go through with some nice pictures, and so hopefully sort of fill in the gaps of what you might have missed in your own work. So without further ado, let me kick off. So again, this is feeding into this first assignment, which is P1, 2, 3, 4, M1, D1. So it's sort of, this is the bit where we're now starting to look at targeting the M1 and D1 with that sort of slightly higher level knowledge. So this is going to require a little bit more reading from yourself. So there's some nice books that you can use to sort of supplement your knowledge, and this is where you really need to start drawing in your own research as well. So if you want it in more detail, there it is. So I'm going to press on. So the aims of this, we're going to explain different types of muscle found in the body. We're going to explain what a muscle fiber is and how there can be different types of muscle fiber. And we're going to analyze the different fiber characteristics needed for different athletes. We may not get into all of that for this presentation. I only wanted this to be quite brief. So we'll leave that for the Wednesday session you're going to have. So we looked previously this concept of agonists, antagonists, fixators and synergists. So in the picture there, you've got a very simple picture showing the biceps contracting and the tricep relaxing as a sort of antagonistic pair. Fixators will fix the scapula to sort of prevent unwanted movement there. If you look at the picture here, you can sort of see that the origin of the biceps is actually on the scapula. So if the scapula itself was unstable, then that muscle wouldn't be able to pull with any force. So that's fairly straightforward. Fixators sort of fix the sort of the origin of a muscle, and the synergists, you get different sort of descriptions of a synergist. I tend to think of them as a muscle that helps out the prime mover. So in this case, you'll have muscles sort of down here called brachialis, which sort of crosses over there. Really strong, actually, probably the more powerful flexor of the elbow, actually. I would consider that to be a synergist. We have a muscle called brachioradialis, which runs down here. If you can just see me putting that in green, which again is a weak flexor, but also sort of helps stabilize that forearm, and so that would be a really classic synergist of that bicep curl. So what is muscle? Well, you've got some nice pictures here. We've got some muscular legs in the top left-hand corner from cyclists, so you can see that muscle sort of changes depending on how we sort of interact with it. On the top right, I've got some meat. So anywhere where you see meat, essentially that is muscle. So we have our own sort of skeletal muscle surrounding our skeleton, in the same way that an animal has their own skeletal muscle surrounding their skeleton. So there has to be a functional purpose for each section of muscle. In the bottom, I've got just sort of areas where you might see smooth muscle and not have considered it. So we've got little blood vessels on the left hand side. We'll look at how smooth muscle is used within blood vessels. We've got the heart. The heart itself is a particular type of muscle, and used to sort of pump blood throughout the body. And then also just under my picture, we've got the digestive system here. So smooth muscle plays an important role in moving food through that digestive system. So let's go to the types of muscle. So what you'll notice, if you look at the top here, it kind of looks stripy. So sometimes you'll see muscle described as being striated. This is really sort of under a microscope. It will look a little bit stripy because of the sort of arrangement of the protein filaments. They sort of overlap, and what they allow is they sort of, where the thicker filament overlaps the thinner filament, it looks sort of stripy, and that's where it gets this description of being striated. The fibers are sort of in parallel, so they kind of line up, and when they contract, we associate with them creating movement, but the contractions are sort of short-lived, so they contract and relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. So it's rare to see a muscle that will stay in that sort of sustained contraction. In the picture below, you've got cardiac muscle. What's quite interesting about their fibers, they're sort of slightly striated too. But what we see, if you think of skeletal muscle fibers as being very long, the cardiac muscles are quite short, and rather than being sort of all in parallel, look at how, just trying to colour it in the colour you can see, yellow or green, cheese and onion, there we are. What you can see is that they sort of branch off, so they allow this sort of full coverage of that sort of round shape of the heart. They also have quite an important feature. I'm going to just sort of colour it in blue here. Is that rather than being very long, they're sort of joined end to end, and this is important because it means that when they receive their electrical stimulus at this point here, on the left hand upper side of the heart, called the sinoatrial node, as that impulse spreads through the heart, as it spreads down, the impulse sort of travels within the fibers end to end, so it can all sort of go, right, we've got one initial start point, and then everything is going to sort of go in this lovely coordinated fashion. The smooth muscle here, it's got an example here of the blood vessel, and what you see with smooth muscle is they're sort of long, sort of almost kind of, I guess, like kind of oval shaped fibers, and when they contract, they can contract for much longer. So whereas skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle contracts, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax, smooth muscle can really contract and stay contracted. In blood vessels, it sort of allows constriction, and then in the digestive system, it allows things to be moved along in waves of contraction. So we'll look at that process in a couple of examples. So here we've got two actions of blood vessels, smooth muscle in the body. On the right hand side, I've got here a blood vessel. So if we think of when we warm up, we're sort of asked to do some exercises. We use the muscles that we want to use during exercise, and part of that's about sort of gradually raising the heart rate, getting it up, but the other part to that is that working muscles cause blood vessels to what's called dilate. So they sort of open up, they relax, and so that relaxation, that what's called vasodilation, allows more blood flow into that muscle, because we have a sort of fairly limited amount of blood in our body, don't we? So it can't do everything. If we think about what our blood needs to do, it needs to supply our brain, our kidneys, our digestive system, our working muscles, keep us warm, cool us down, all these things. So it can't do everything at once. So it's sort of, as I start exercising, I need to open up blood vessels that go to my working muscles. But also, on the left-hand side, we've got that much narrower blood vessel. We could potentially constrict blood vessels which go to areas which at that time we don't need them. So for example, when I'm exercising, I don't need to be digesting my food. So the blood vessels of the digestive tract sort of constrict and limit blood flow to there. That's why we shouldn't go swimming immediately after a meal, because as we're swimming, our arms are sort of taking all the blood, and there's nothing left for our digestive tract to sort of keep that food down. So this concept of vaso, meaning blood vessel, and dilation, meaning getting wider, and constriction, getting narrower, is a really important example to state when you're considering that concept of smooth muscle. So it's the smooth muscle in the blood vessel isn't about pumping, it's about slow, sustained contractions that alter blood flow. On the right hand side, we've got peristalsis. So this is how smooth muscle is used in the digestive tract. What we see on this top picture here, we've kind of got this what's called a bolus of food. So you can imagine a any sort of, this could be sort of down through the esophagus. This could actually be anywhere in the digestive tract. But peristalsis is how the smooth muscle creates waves of contraction. It sort of gradually squeezes that food through the tract. So it's not, again, not a sort of sharp pumping. It's slow, sustained waves of contraction. If you've ever seen a snake eating an egg that's too big for itself, that's how it gets that egg down through its body. It's these waves of slow contraction, peristalsis. So here's just a nice picture. It just shows the varying degrees of muscle in different blood vessels. At the top we've got an artery, so smooth muscle. So here we've got endothelial, which is a one single cell sort of layer. It's the same as capillaries, so really thin, too thin to take any degree of pressure. When the heart pumps, there's a lot of pressure comes out of it. So to surround that blood vessel, you've got this elastic tissue in arteries, which means that as that blood pumps, they sort of expand slightly, and then they almost sort of just recoil. They don't pump, they just recoil. So there's always a boom, boom, boom. To help that job, we've got a big layer of smooth muscle. So you can see that there, and that is there. So smooth muscle, again, sort of helps that recoil, that elasticity helps sort of absorb that pressure, but also it helps squeeze and constrict to areas where you don't want that blood flow. So digestive tract when you're exercising, and it allows a relaxation where you are exercising, those muscles are being used. If we look at veins down the bottom, they also have smooth muscle, not quite so much, and they're not under pressure veins. So veins sort of gradually take blood back to the body, so they require a bit of squeezing from the muscles. But one thing they do need to do, at rest, veins are a little bit baggy. So when we start exercising, when we kind of give that signal that right, we're switching on now, veins just gently constrict, and they just make a little bit more pressure in them, and they sort of almost bring more blood back up to the body just by sort of, I guess, sort of add that little bit of added pressure into those peripheral veins, just squeezes the blood vessels and sort of makes more available for the rest of the body. So it aids what's called venous return, and that's just, again, it's just an important squeezing of those blood vessels. So here is a nice picture that shows the varying blood flow at rest and during vigorous exercise. So here we've got cardiac output at rest, just under 6 litres. So I guess if you looked at someone who, if you sort of think, an average heart rate of maybe sort of 70, then what are you getting there? So maybe a stroke volume of around, I don't know, I'm doing the maths sort of quickly, say somewhere around 75 to 80 millilitres will probably get you near that 5.8 litres per minute. So at that point, you can see about 13% of blood flow goes to your brain. 4% actually supplies the heart with its own blood supply. But look how much you get going to these organs. 19% going to the kidneys to do the sort of filtering of the blood. Nearly a quarter is going to the digestive tract. And only 21% in your skeletal muscles. Now, as a sort of total volume then, you can see that your digestive tract gets, what, 24% of roughly 6 litres. So I guess you're looking somewhere about 1.5 litres, just under 1.5 litres per minute. Still quite a lot, isn't it, when you think about it? Whereas if you look at what happens when we start exercising, now look how much cardiac output has changed. So now it's gone up to nearly 26 litres a minute. So you've now got someone whose heart rate can be north of 180 beats per minute, and also the stroke volume increases. So you now get a stroke volume of sort of above, let's say, 100 millilitres. So you've got an increased stroke volume, a greatly increased heart rate, which now means this person has increased their cardiac output, the amount of blood that's ejected from their left ventricle during exercise, to nearly 26 litres. So what's interesting is the brain now gets 3%, but if you calculate that as a pure volume, so 3% of just under 26 litres, you should, and I'm going to get you to do the math in a minute, you should find that it's not far off, should be almost exactly the same, as 13% of this 5.8 litres. Because when we exercise, we don't want more blood going to our brain. It doesn't work like that, you know, it would just damage it. So that's going to stay pretty constant. So that's a pretty good example of why our blood vessels will want to constrict, to limit flow to a particular organ. Because if they're not, we would end up with a massively swollen brain that wouldn't work. But interestingly, if you look at 1% of blood flow going to the digestive tract, 1% of 25 litres isn't close to this, is it? 25% of just under 6 litres. So there's a really huge variation. And now look here, look how much now blood is going to my skeletal muscle. 88% of just under 26 litres compared to 21% of just under 6 litres. There's huge variation. So this is all happening because of blood vessels constricting and dilating. So you have a task on this next slide, and what I want you to calculate is, I want you to calculate the absolute volume. How many litres? So here, how many litres of blood are going to your brain at rest compared to your brain during exercise? So these are really nice calculations to do, because they'll be able to give you something to explain with reference to how smooth muscle works in the body, rather than just saying it sticks in blood vessels. You know, you can say we use it to alter blood flow. For example, our brain needs a constant supply of blood, so blood vessels would constrict to limit flow, keeping it at an exact however many litres you work out, whilst our skeletal muscle goes from taking less than, or somewhere near 1/5 of our blood to somewhere near, I don't know, what have we got, sort of 8/10 of our blood. So there's quite a marked difference. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes to calculate those. It might take a good 5 minutes to get through it, and then we'll regroup. So just pause the presentation and we'll catch up. So now, your next job, Gigi's going to set it. Your next job is now to go to your workbooks and create your explanation of smooth muscle. So in your explanation of smooth muscle, what you're going to do is you're going to use each of these words. So you can use my lead-in phrase here. So smooth muscle lines blood vessels, including arteries and veins. In arteries, a smooth muscle is used to And I want you to include these words: resistance, elasticity, blood flow, vasoconstrict, dilate, peristalsis, and move. So remember, the two big things you want to get across is that smooth muscle is found in the digestive tract and blood vessels, and you're going to give me an example of each and you're going to make it good. Okay, so pause for 10 and catch up in a minute. Okay, welcome back. So I just want you to take a quick minute to read my explanation of cardiac muscle. So on the left hand side you may want to pause. I'm going to just read through quickly and then you can have a pause. So cardiac muscle is the heart. So you can buy a heart in a supermarket. You can buy a sheep's heart and eat it. It's essentially, it is a muscle. It is a fairly, I guess, almost not fibrous so much, but the fibers themselves are very, very aerobic. So if we think about our heart, it has to beat over 100,000 times a day. So it has to be very, very specialist. It can't have sort of fatty lumps in it. It has to be pretty on point to do its job of receiving oxygenated blood and converting it into contractions. So essentially it has to be so good at converting the fuel it gets in the form of, well, converting the I guess the fuel it gets in our blood into movement. It also has a really good ability to coordinate its own contraction. So whereas, say, a bicep needs nerve impulses to each group of fibers within it, our heart actually creates its own impulses. So the fibers are always on a sort of fine balance. They're almost kind of ready to contract. And just slight changes in the amount of certain sort of ions, things like potassium, calcium, and sodium around them, will cause them to just instantly contract. So this generally occurs in a sort of bundle at the top on the left hand side called the sinoatrial node. So the sinoatrial node almost kind of creates a contraction, and it sort of works like a wave throughout that heart. The fibers are very specialist to allow them to sort of transmit that contraction, or that impulse to contract right the way through the fibers. So I'm going to just read out the section on the left hand side. You might want to sort of pause and just read through it yourself as well. So where skeletal muscle fibers each need a nerve stimulation to contract, cardiac muscle contractions are generated by impulses in the sinoatrial node, and the nerve activity moves in a wave across the heart, causing the fibers to contract in a coordinated fashion. The heart rate is influenced by release of adrenaline from the kidneys, which speeds it up, and by action of the parasympathetic nervous system, which slows it down. So we can sort of see our systems kind of working together. That when we exercise, adrenaline will be released, which causes that increase in heart rate. But it also sort of that sort of whole sympathetic activity acts to constrict blood vessels going to things like our digestive tract, and sort of raise our heart rate and our blood pressure as well. So cardiac muscle, I'm going to continue on the next slide, generates its own impulses and is influenced by adrenaline to increase the heart rate. So we have this area at the top left called the sinoatrial node, and adrenaline up here causes the heart rate to increase. So normally it beats roughly 100,000 times a day, and it doesn't fatigue unless the blood supply is interrupted. So you might just, if I put it in blue, can you see the coronary artery and vein? So these sort of loop off sort of back here somewhere. They sort of loop off this aorta. So if we can imagine the left ventricle pumps, and it pumps up into that aorta, that blood goes round down the back of the heart, down here, but off the top here, the coronary arteries supply blood to the heart. So when they become blocked, they cause an interruption in blood flow to the heart, which can create an ischemic condition. So angina is an ischemic ischemia of the heart. So it's a lack of blood flow, lack of oxygenation to that heart, which causes it to kind of almost cry out. And that's where you get those sort of central chest pains associated with raised activity. So what you're going to do now, you can quickly review cardiac muscle in your workbook, in your textbooks. But what you're going to do is you're going to provide for me a description of cardiac muscle, and you're going to use those following words. So you're going to describe cardiac muscle using the words muscular pump, chambers, you're going to say moves blood, circulation, fatigue resistance, autoarrhythmic, which means they generate their own heartbeat, coordinated, adrenaline release from kidneys, and parasympathetic nervous system slows. So plan it out before you write. Make sure you've got it very clear in your head where you're going with your explanation. And I've given you these words to try and get you away from that Wikipedia type explanation. So you should be able to link it together. So the cardiac muscle helps form the heart, which is a muscular pump which supplies blood to the body. It's made up of 4 chambers separated by a central septum, and it moves blood through the pulmonary circulation to oxygenate the blood to the body, which is called the systemic circulation. The cardiac fibers themselves are fatigue resistant because they're going to beat over 100,000 times each day. They're also autoarrhythmic, which means they create their own heart rate. You can do the rest, but you get the idea. So if you've got that framework, you should be able to sort of describe your own sort of ideas and really get out of that sort of Wikipedia kind of thinking. Okay, so we're going to talk about skeletal muscle in the next presentation, but when you've finished your explanation of smooth and cardiac muscle, I now need you to read ahead the section from your course book, the Stafford Brown course book on skeletal muscle, and particularly what I want you to do, I want you to just get clear in your head this broad structure of this, what's called the epimysium over the top, made up of groups of fibers called fascicles, and then a fiber being made up of little rods of protein. So I just want you to review that structure, and I want you to read ahead onto the difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So make notes. I want you to think of key words and key facts, and then I want you to bring them to the session tomorrow.